In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a shadow stirs at Lavender Cottage. Woman in lavender, gone for 50 years, yet never truly left. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, senses a mystery in the widow Elspeth Grey, whose lavender dresses and haunted gaze hide a secret. Whispered voice, she vanished, but her brooch remains. Midway, a locked door is broken, revealing letters that whisper of murder. Lavinia Grey's love, her betrayal, and a jealous killer who fled. Is Elspeth seeking justice, or is she part of the past's dark weave? Footsteps echo, a figure in lavender vanishes into the night, but the truth waits, buried in the cottage's cellar, where bones in a lavender gown hold the final clue. Will Marple unravel the killer's identity before the lady in lavender claims another soul? A scream, then silence. The past never forgets, and neither does Miss Marple. Chapter 1. The arrival at Lavender Cottage, in the gentle hum of St. Mary Mead, where the days unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a well-wound clock. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving with the precision of a metronome. The soft click of the needles was a counterpoint to the rustle of leaves outside, where autumn had begun to paint the village in shades of amber and gold. Her cottage, a modest affair with roses climbing the trellis, offered a clear view of the high street, where villagers went about their business with the unhurried pace of those who know their neighbours' secrets as well as their own. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, missed little. She had long ago learned that the smallest gesture, a glance, a hesitation, a too quick smile could unravel a mystery as surely as her needles unraveled a skein of wool. The village had been abuzz for weeks with talk of Lavender Cottage, a charming but neglected house on the outskirts, its stone walls half hidden by ivy and its garden a tangle of wild roses and lavender bushes. The cottage had stood empty for years, its windows dark, its chimneys silent, ever since the strange disappearance of its last occupant, a young woman named Lavinia Grey, some 50 years past. Lavinia, so the village lore went, had been a beauty, always clad in lavender gowns, her laughter as light as the breeze. She had vanished one night, leaving behind only whispers of a broken engagement and a heartbroken suitor. Some said she had run away. Others, with a shiver, claimed she haunted the cottage still, her lavender-clad figure seen in the moonlight. Miss Marple, who placed little stock in ghosts, but much in human nature, found the tale intriguing, though she had never set foot in the cottage herself. Now, the village was alive with fresh gossip. Lavender Cottage had been sold. The new owner, a widow named Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, had arrived quietly, her belongings delivered in a single van under the cover of dusk. Little was known of her, save that she was from London, childless, and possessed of a modest fortune. She was said to be elegant, with silver hair and a penchant for lavender dresses, a detail that set tongues wagging. It's as if Lavinia herself has returned, Mrs. Bantry had remarked at the Women's Institute, her eyes bright with the thrill of speculation. Miss Marple, present at the meeting, had merely smiled and adjusted her shawl, but her mind had begun to turn, like a wheel slowly gathering speed. On a crisp October morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple received an invitation. It was delivered by young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, who handed her a cream-coloured envelope with a grin and a tip of his cap. The envelope, addressed in a flowing, almost antique hand, bore the scent of lavender, faint but unmistakable. Inside was a card, embossed with a delicate border of violets, inviting Miss Marple to a small tea at Lavender Cottage the following afternoon. Mrs. Harrow, it seemed, wished to introduce herself to a select few of St. Mary Mead's residents. The invitation was formal, almost excessively so, as if written by someone accustomed to a different era. Miss Marple, who had a nose for the unusual, felt a prickle of curiosity. She accepted at once, penning a reply in her neat, precise script. The day of the tea dawned bright, with a chill in the air that hinted at winter's approach. Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan knot. Out of deference to the cottage's name, but because it suited her, she pinned a small brooch to her collar, a habit born of practicality rather than vanity, and set out with her walking stick, though she used it more for effect than necessity. The walk to Lavender Cottage was pleasant, the path winding past the vicarage and the blacksmith's forge, where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil provided a familiar backdrop. As she approached the cottage, she noted its transformation. The ivy had been trimmed, the windows gleamed, and the lavender bushes, though still wild, had been coaxed into some semblance of order. A faint perfume hung in the air, sweet and melancholic. The door was opened by a maid, a young woman with a nervous air and a starched apron that seemed too large for her slight frame. She introduced herself as Ellen, her voice barely above a whisper, and led Miss Marple into a drawing room that was both elegant and slightly unsettling. The furniture was old, but polished to a high sheen. The walls adorned with faded portraits of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to follow the visitor. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows, and the air was heavy, with the scent of lavender, as if the very walls exhaled it. A silver tea service gleamed on a mahogany table, and beside it stood Mrs. Elspeth Harrow. Mrs. Harrow was a striking figure, tall and slender, with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her dress, a deep lavender silk, shimmered faintly in the firelight, and a broocher delicate filigree of silver and amethyst gleamed at her throat. Her face was pale, her features sharp yet softened by age, and her blue eyes held a keen intelligence that Miss Marple noted at once. There was, however, a tension in her posture, a slight rigidity in her smile, as if she were playing a part she had not fully rehearsed. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Mrs. Harrow said, her voice low and cultured, with a trace of an accent Miss Marple could not place. "I've heard so much about you. They say you see everything." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to watch the world go by. St. Mary Mead is a small stage, but it has its share of dramas." Mrs. Harrow's laugh was polite but brief, and she gestured to the other guests who were beginning to arrive. There was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, a bluff man with a kind heart and a tendency to speak his mind. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose enthusiasm for gossip was matched only by her loyalty to her friends, and Mr. Clement, the vicar, whose gentle demeanor hid a sharp mind. The group was small, intimate, and carefully chosen, Miss Marple thought, as if Mrs. Harrow were testing the waters of village society. Tea was served with meticulous care, the maid Ellen moving silently among them, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries: weather, the state of the roads, the upcoming church fete, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She observed Mrs. Harrow's hands, which fluttered nervously when not occupied with her teacup, and her eyes, which darted occasionally to a heavy oak door at the far end of the room. The door was locked, its brass keyhole gleaming in the firelight, and it seemed to draw Mrs. Harrow's gaze like a magnet. Mrs. Bantry, ever the catalyst, broke the polite rhythm of the conversation. "This cottage is simply charming, Mrs. Harrow," she said, her voice bright. "But it does have a reputation, you know. They say it's haunted by a lady in lavender, Lavinia Grey, wasn't it? Vanished without a trace, poor thing. Have you seen any ghosts yet?" She laughed, but the sound faltered as Mrs. Harrow's teacup rattled in its saucer. The widow's smile tightened. "I don't believe in ghosts, Mrs. Bantry," she said, her voice clipped. "Old houses have their stories, but I prefer to live in the present." She turned to Mr. Clement, asking about the church's restoration fund, and the moment passed. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the faint flush on Mrs. Harrow's cheeks and the way her fingers tightened around her cup. The mention of Lavinia Grey had struck a nerve, and Miss Marple's mind, like a needle finding its thread, began to stitch together possibilities. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation grew livelier, though Mrs. Harrow remained reserved, her contributions polite but guarded. Dr. Haydock spoke of a new treatment for rheumatism. Mr. Clement mused on the virtues of charity, and Mrs. Bantry recounted a scandal involving the butcher's wife and a delivery boy. Miss Marple listened, her eyes half closed, but her mind was alert, cataloguing every word, every gesture. She noticed that Mrs. Harrow avoided looking at the locked door, yet her body seemed oriented toward it, as if drawn by an invisible thread. When Ellen dropped a spoon with a clatter, Mrs. Harrow started visibly, her hand flying to her brooch. The tea ended with promises to meet again, and Miss Marple made her farewells, her mind already turning over what she had seen. As she stepped into the fading light, she glanced back at Lavender Cottage, its windows glowing like eyes in the dusk. The scent of lavender followed her, clinging to her shawl, and she wondered if it was merely the garden or something deeper. Something tied to the woman who had vanished and the widow who now wore her colour. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The invitation lay on the table, its violet border catching the lamplight. She thought of Mrs. Harrow's elegance, her unease, and the locked door that seemed to hold the key to something unspoken. In her long experience, people who locked doors had something to hide, and those who wore their secrets as boldly as a lavender dress were often the most complex. She recalled the village tales of Lavinia Grey, the broken engagement, the suitor who had left St. Mary Mead in haste. Thomas Reed. His name had been a man with a temper, some said, and a jealousy that burned like a slow fuse. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the brooch on Mrs. Harrow's dress. It was not merely similar to the one described in old stories of Lavinia. It was identical, down to the twist of silver around the amethyst, a family heirloom, perhaps, or something more. She made a mental note to visit the village library, where dusty newspapers might hold clues to Lavinia's fate. The scent of lavender lingered in her memory, as persistent as a question that demanded an answer. As the clock struck 7, Miss Marple rose to make tea, her movements deliberate but her mind racing. St. Mary Mead was a quiet place, but beneath its surface lay currents of human passion, love, fear, guilt that could ripple outward in unexpected ways. Mrs. Harrow, with her lavender dresses and her locked door, was a ripple that Miss Marple intended to follow. She had no proof, only instinct, but instinct had served her well before. Somewhere in Lavender Cottage, she felt certain, lay a truth as delicate and dangerous as the scent that filled its air. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village lights winking out one by one. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as the lace on her table. The lady in lavender, whether ghost or memory, had returned, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would uncover why. Chapter 2. The gathering the afternoon sun slanted through the mullioned windows of Lavender Cottage, casting a golden glow across the drawing room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room, though elegant, had an air of restraint, as if its occupant had polished it to perfection, but could not quite erase the weight of its past. The walls, papered in a faded pattern of lilacs, bore portraits of stern ancestors, their eyes fixed on the small assembly gathered for Mrs. Elspeth Harrow's tea. The scent of lavender, subtle yet pervasive, hung in the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed tea and warm scones. Miss Marple, her sharp eyes softened by a gentle smile, observed the scene with the quiet attentiveness of one who knew that truth often hid in the smallest details. Mrs. Harrow stood by the tea table, her lavender silk dress catching the light. As she poured with practiced grace, her movements were precise, almost too careful, as if she feared a misstep might betray her. Her silver hair gleamed under the chandelier, and the amethyst brooch at her throat, a delicate twist of silver that Miss Marple had noted the day before, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The guests, a carefully curated selection from St. Mary Mead's modest society, included Dr. Haydock, whose ruddy face and hearty laugh filled the room. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her eyes bright with curiosity. Mr. Clement, the vicar, whose thoughtful silences spoke as loudly as his words, and Miss Marple herself, who had accepted the invitation with a blend of politeness and purpose. The maid, Ellen, moved among them, her starched apron rustling as she offered a tray of cucumber sandwiches. Her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted to Mrs. Harrow with a mixture of deference and unease. Miss Marple noted this, as she noted everything. The way Ellen avoided the locked oak door at the room's far end. The way Mrs. Harrow's smile tightened when Dr. Haydock complimented the cottage's restoration. And the way the firelight flickered on the brass keyhole of that mysterious door, as if inviting scrutiny. Conversation began with the usual pleasantries. Dr. Haydock spoke of the autumn's unseasonable warmth, predicting a harsh winter to follow. "Mark my words," he said, his voice booming, "we'll be snowed in by January, and I'll be trudging through drifts to visit patients." Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a topic linger too long, countered with a tale of her garden's late-blooming roses, which she swore were the envy of the county. Mr. Clement, stirring his tea, mentioned the church's need for a new roof, his tone gentle but hopeful, as if Mrs. Harrow might be persuaded to contribute. Miss Marple listened, her head tilted slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of her saucer. She was content to let others talk, knowing that silence often drew out more than questions. Mrs. Harrow played the hostess with skill, her responses polite but measured. She spoke of her love for old houses, her decision to leave London's clamour for the peace of St. Mary Mead, and her plans to restore Lavender Cottage to its former glory. Yet there was a brittleness to her words, a sense that she was reciting a script rather than sharing her heart. Miss Marple, who had seen many such performances in her time, wondered what lay behind the widow's careful facade. Was it grief, as one might expect from a woman who had lost her husband, or something else, something tied to the cottage, to the lavender that seemed to define her? The conversation took a turn when Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist the lure of gossip, leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. "This cottage has quite a history, Mrs. Harrow," she said, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. "They say it's haunted, you know. The lady in lavender, Lavinia Grey, wasn't it? Vanished 50 years ago, leaving nothing but stories. Some swear they've seen her, gliding through the garden at dusk, still in her lavender gown. Have you heard the tale? The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Harrow's hand paused mid-pour, and a single drop of tea splashed onto the tablecloth, a dark stain spreading like a secret. Her face remained composed, but her eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the locked door. I'm afraid I don't put much stock in ghost stories, Mrs. Bantry, she said, her voice cool but strained. Old houses creak and groan, and imaginations do the rest. Shall I refill your cup? Mrs. Bantry, undeterred, pressed on. Oh, but it's such a romantic story. Lavinia was engaged, wasn't she? To a young man who died suddenly. Heart trouble, they said, though some whispered poison. And then she disappeared, poof, like smoke. The village was in an uproar. My mother used to say, Lavinia's suitor, that Thomas Reed was a jealous sort. He left St. Mary Mead right after, which only fueled the talk. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Harrow closely. The widow's lips pressed into a thin line, and her fingers tightened around the teapot's handle. How tragic, she said, her tone flat. But I prefer to focus on the present. The cottage is mine now, and I intend to make it a home. She turned to Mr. Clement, asking about the church fete, and the moment passed, but not before Miss Marple caught the faint flush on Mrs. Harrow's cheeks and the way her gaze lingered on the locked door, as if it held the answer to Mrs. Bantry's tale. The tea continued, with scones and clotted cream making their rounds. Dr. Haydock shared a humorous anecdote about a patient who mistook his cough syrup for sherry, and Mr. Clement spoke of a sermon he was preparing on forgiveness. Miss Marple contributed little, her comments confined to the quality of the tea and the beauty of the lavender bushes outside. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments she had gathered. Mrs. Harrow's unease, the locked door, the brooch that matched descriptions of Lavinia Grey's, and the village's enduring fascination with a woman who had vanished half a century ago. As the guests prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Ellen clear the tea things up. Pretext to stay a moment longer. The maid, flustered, accepted, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to study the room more closely. The locked door, heavy and unyielding, stood out against the delicate decor. Its brass keyhole polished but scratched, as if someone had tried to force it open. She glanced at Mrs. Harrow, who was bidding farewell to Dr. Haydock, her smile as tight as a drawn bowstring. When Ellen dropped a saucer, the crash echoed like a gunshot, and Mrs. Harrow spun around, her hand flying to her brooch. Careful, Ellen, she said sharply, then softened her tone. No harm done. Miss Marple, handing Ellen a napkin, noted the maid's pale face and the way her eyes darted to her mistress. There was fear there, but of what? The cottage, the locked door, or Mrs. Harrow herself? As she made her farewells, Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her gaze sweeping the room one last time. The lavender scent was stronger now, almost cloying, and she wondered if it came from the garden or something within the cottage's walls. Outside, the air was cool, the sky streaked with the pinks and purples of dusk. Miss Marple walked slowly, her stick tapping the path, her thoughts as tangled as the ivy around Lavender Cottage. Mrs. Harrow was hiding something. That much was clear, but whether it was tied to Lavinia Grey or some private sorrow, she could not yet say. The brooch, the locked door, the widow's reaction to Mrs. Bantry's tale, they were threads in a pattern, and Miss Marple, with her knack for unravelling, would follow them wherever they led. Back in her cottage, she lit a lamp and settled. into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The invitation to the tea lay on her table, its violet border a reminder of the day's discoveries. She thought of Lavinia Grey, the lady in lavender, whose story had lingered in St. Mary Mead like a half-forgotten song. Mrs. Harrow's arrival had stirred that song to life, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would listen until she understood its melody. Chapter 3. The Whisper of Doubt. The morning after the tea at Lavender Cottage. Miss Jane Marple awoke with the first light of dawn, her mind already stirring with the impressions of the previous day. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet outside. Her window, its rooftops dusted with the faint mist that autumn mornings often brought. She rose, her movements brisk despite the slight stiffness in her joints, and set about her morning routine with the precision of habit. As she boiled water for tea, her thoughts returned to Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, her lavender dress, her guarded demeanor, and the locked oak door that seemed to anchor the drawing room like a silent sentinel. There was a mystery here, Miss Marple felt certain, and it was not the sort to be solved by idle gossip or hasty conclusions. She sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of Earl Grey steaming before her, and considered the facts. Mrs. Harrow's reaction to Mrs. Bantry's mention of Lavinia Grey had been subtle, but unmistakably tightening of the lips, a flicker of unease in those sharp blue eyes. The brooch, too, was a puzzle. Miss Marple had read in old village records, years ago, that Lavinia Grey had worn a distinctive amethyst brooch, its silver filigree crafted in the shape of a lavender sprig. The brooch on Mrs. Harrow's dress was identical, or so it seemed, and Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences where human motives were concerned. Was Mrs. Harrow a relative of Lavinia's, perhaps, carrying a family heirloom? Or was there a deeper connection, one tied to the cottage's shadowed past? The village lore about Lavinia Grey was vivid, if fragmented. 50 years ago, Lavinia had been the belle of St. Mary Mead, her beauty softened by a quiet grace that won her many admirers. She had been engaged to a young man, Edward Langley, whose sudden death, officially attributed to a weak heart, had cast a pall over the village. Lavinia had vanished soon after, leaving behind a wardrobe of lavender gowns and a mystery that had grown with the telling. Some said she had fled in grief, others that she had met with foul play, and a few whispered of a ghostly figure seen in the cottage's garden, clad in lavender and weeping. Miss Marple, who had little patience for spectral tales, suspected the truth lay in more earthly realms: jealousy, perhaps, or betrayal. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the post, delivered by young Tommy Pierce, whose cheerful whistle announced him long before his knock. Among the letters was a note from Mrs. Bantry, written in her sprawling hand, inviting Miss Marple to lunch at Gossington Hall to discuss the tea. "There's something odd about that, Mrs. Harrow," the note read, "and I'm dying to hear your thoughts." Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Bantry's enthusiasm was as predictable as it was useful, for her gossip often contained kernels of truth, however embellished. After breakfast, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, choosing a sensible tweed and a scarf, in a muted shade of violet knot, out of deference to Lavender Cottage, but because it suited the chill in the air. Her destination was the village library, a small building tucked behind the post office, its shelves heavy with the musty scent of old books and older secrets. Miss Marple had often found answers in its dusty archives, where newspapers and parish records held the past in brittle pages. The librarian, Miss Ellis, a prim woman with a passion for local history, greeted her warmly. "Looking for something particular, Miss Marple?" she asked, adjusting her spectacles. "Oh, Just indulging an old woman's curiosity, Miss Marple replied, her tone light. I've been thinking about Lavender Cottage and its history. Anything on Lavinia Grey, perhaps? Miss Ellis's eyes lit up. A fascinating story. There's not much, but we have some old newspapers from the time. Let me fetch them. She disappeared into the stacks, returning with a bound volume of the St. Mary Mead Gazette, its pages yellowed and fragile. Miss Marple settled at a table by the window, her gloved hands turning the pages with care. The articles were sparse but telling. In June 1875, Lavinia Grey, aged 22, had been reported missing after failing to appear at a village fete. Her fiancé, Edward Langley, had died 2 weeks prior, his death attributed to heart failure, though the paper hinted at rumors of poison, dismissed as idle speculation. Suspicion had fallen on Thomas Reed, a local man known for his temper and his unrequited affection for Lavinia. Reed had left St. Mary Mead days after her disappearance, fueling talk of guilt, though no evidence was found. One article mentioned Lavinia's lavender brooch, a gift from her late mother, which she wore daily. A distinctive piece, the reporter noted, unlikely to be mistaken. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page. The brooch was a link, but to what? She thanked Miss Ellis and stepped into the crisp air, her mind turning over the details. Thomas Reed's departure was curious, hasty, perhaps, but not proof of wrongdoing. And yet, the timing of Lavinia's disappearance, so soon after Edward's death, suggested a chain of events that had yet to be fully untangled. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Harrow, her elegance a stark contrast to the nervous energy she betrayed. Was she merely a newcomer drawn to a picturesque cottage, or did she carry a piece of its past? Lunch at Gossington Hall was a lively affair, with Mrs. Bantry presiding over a table laden with cold meats and apple tart. Colonel Bantry, her husband, was absent, off on a fishing trip, leaving the two women to dissect the tea at Lavender Cottage. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with excitement, wasted no time. Jane, that Mrs. Harrow is a puzzle. Did you see how she jumped when I mentioned Lavinia Grey? And that brooch positively eerie, don't you think? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. She was certainly unsettled. She agreed, though it may be the cottage itself. Old houses carry their histories, and not everyone is comfortable with that. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Do you think she's related to Lavinia? A cousin, perhaps, or a niece. She's got that same irrelegant, but haunted, if you ask me. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal, but appearances can deceive. I recall a case in my youth, a girl in our village who wore her mother's locket to honor her, only to find it held a secret that nearly cost her life. People wear things for all sorts of reasons. Double quotes. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You don't think Mrs. Harrow's in danger, do you? Or, oh, Jane, you don't think she's hiding something dreadful? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think, Dolly, that Mrs. Harrow is a woman with a purpose. What that purpose is, I cannot yet say, but I intend to find out. The lunch ended with Mrs. Bantry promising to keep her ears open for any village talk. About Mrs. Harrow, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts as restless as the leaves skittering across the path. She sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap, but her needles lay still. The whisper of doubt had taken root, fed by Mrs. Harrow's unease, the locked door, and the echo of Lavinia Grey's story. Miss Marple knew that doubt, like a seed, needed only time and care to grow into certainty. She would watch and listen and wait For in St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of surfacing, as surely as the lavender bloomed each spring. Chapter 4. The locked door. The days following the tea at Lavender Cottage settled into the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead, where the passage of time was marked by the chime of the church clock and the daily rounds of the milkman. Yet, beneath this placid surface, Miss Jane Marple sensed a current of unease, as subtle and persistent as the scent of lavender that seemed to linger in her memory. Her visit to the cottage had left her with questions that refused to be dismissed. The locked oak door, Mrs. Elspeth Harrow's guarded demeanor, and the amethyst brooch that echoed descriptions of Lavinia Grey's cherished heirloom. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing patterns where others saw only fragments, was determined to fit them together. On a brisk morning, with the sky a pale wash of blue and the air sharp with the promise of frost, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Mrs. Harrow. She chose her pretext carefully: a borrowed teacup, left behind at the tea, which she would return with apologies for her forgetfulness. It was a flimsy excuse, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that the simplest ruses often opened the most guarded doors. She dressed in a woolen coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, her appearance as unassuming as ever, though her eyes were bright with purpose. As she walked the winding path to Lavender Cottage, her stick tapping lightly on the cobblestones, she noted the village waking around her, the baker's boy whistling as he delivered loaves, the postman sorting letters, and Mrs. Price, the village's oldest gossip, peering from her window with unabashed curiosity. Lavender Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its stone walls softened by ivy and its garden a riot of late-blooming roses and lavender bushes, their fragrance heavy in the morning air. The windows gleamed, reflecting the sky, but there was a stillness about the place, as if it held its breath. Miss Marple knocked, and the door was opened by Ellen, the maid, whose pale face and nervous hands seemed no less tense than at the tea. "Good morning, Ellen," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "I've come to return a teacup I seem to have taken by mistake. Is Mrs. Harrow at home?" Ellen hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the interior of the cottage. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "She's in the drawing room. I'll fetch her." She led Miss Marple inside, her steps quick and silent, as if eager to retreat. The drawing room was much as Miss Marple remembered it. The polished furniture, the faded portraits, the fire crackling in the hearth. But the locked oak door at the far end drew her attention, its brass keyhole catching the light like a winking eye. Mrs. Harrow appeared moments later, her lavender dress a soft contrast to the room's muted tones. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and the amethyst brooch gleamed at her throat, its silver filigree unmistakable. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," she said, though her smile was thin, her eyes wary. "To what do I owe this visit?" Miss Marple held up the teacup, a delicate piece of porcelain that she had, in truth, borrowed deliberately. "I'm afraid I walked off with this the other day," she said, her tone apologetic. "I do hope it hasn't caused any inconvenience." Mrs. Harrow's smile relaxed, but only slightly. "Not at all. Ellen, take the teacup to the kitchen." The maid obeyed, her movements swift, and Miss Marple seized the moment to steer the conversation. "This is such a charming cottage," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "The upper rooms must be lovely, with such fine views of the garden. Have you had time to explore them all?" Mrs. Harrow's expression tightened, her fingers brushing the brooch. "The upstairs is private," she said, her voice clipped. "I keep it locked. Old houses have their quirks, and I prefer to keep things orderly." She gestured toward a chair. "Would you like to sit? I can have Ellen bring tea." Miss Marple declined with a smile, her eyes lingering on the locked door. "Oh, I won't keep you long. I just thought the upper rooms might hold some of the cottage's history. Old houses are like books, aren't they? Full of stories waiting to be read." Mrs. Harrow's laugh was brittle. "Perhaps, but I'm no historian. I bought this place for its peace, not its past." She moved to the tea table, as if to busy herself, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands. The conversation turned to safer topics, the weather, the village's annual fete, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the door. As she made her farewells, she paused near it, her sharp eyes catching a faint scratch mark near the keyhole, as if someone had tried to force it open. It was a small detail, but to Miss Marple it was as loud as a shout. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as she pondered the visit. The locked door was more than a quirk. It was a barrier, and barriers, in her experience, were erected to hide something: grief, guilt, or perhaps a truth too painful to face. Mrs. Harrow's refusal to discuss the upper rooms, coupled with her unease at the mention of Lavinia Grey, suggested a connection to the cottage's past. The scratch mark was intriguing, hinting at an attempt to breach the door's secrecy, perhaps by Ellen, whose nervousness was palpable, or by someone else entirely. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village's history. Lavinia Grey's disappearance had left a scar on St. Mary Mead, its edges softened by time but never fully healed. The newspapers she had read in the library mentioned Thomas Reed, the jealous suitor who had fled after Lavinia vanished. Could he still be alive? An old man now, drawn back by the cottage's new occupant. Or was Mrs. Harrow herself the key, her lavender dresses, an heirloom brooch, a deliberate echo of Lavinia's memory? To test her suspicions, Miss Marple decided to enlist an ally. She wrote to her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a flair for investigation, though he often underestimated his aunt's acumen. Her letter was brief but precise, asking him to visit and keep an eye on Lavender Cottage, particularly at night, when shadows might reveal what daylight concealed. She also requested he look into any surviving relatives of Lavinia Grey, perhaps a sister or cousin who might shed light on Mrs. Harrow's identity. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit her lamp and sat by the window, her eyes on the darkening village. The scent of lavender, real or imagined, seemed to linger, a reminder of the mystery that had taken root. She thought of her own youth, of a neighbor who had locked her attic door to hide letters from a forbidden love, letters that had nearly led to tragedy. People locked doors for reasons, and Mrs. Harrow's reason, Miss Marple was certain, was tied to the lady in lavender who had never truly left. The church clock chimed 9, its notes carrying across the quiet village. Miss Marple rose to make tea, her mind as active as her hands were still. The locked door was a challenge, but challenges, to her, were merely invitations to look closer. She would wait and watch and listen, for in St. Mary Mead, the truth had a way of slipping through even the tightest locks. Chapter 5. The midnight visitor, the quiet of St. Mary Mead was never absolute, for even in the stillness of night, the village hummed with its own subtle life, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the soft creak of a gate left unlatched. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her bedroom window with a shawl about her shoulders, knew this rhythm well. The night was her ally, a time when secrets, cloaked by daylight, sometimes stepped into the open. Her visit to Lavender Cottage had deepened. Her sense of unease, and the locked door, with its faint scratch mark, lingered in her mind like a note held too long. Mrs. Elspeth Harrow's guarded manner, her lavender dresses, and the amethyst brooch that mirrored Lavinia Grey's were threads in a tapestry Miss Marple was determined to unravel. A week had passed since the TA, and the village had found fresh fuel for its gossip. Mr. Clement, the vicar, had mentioned at the Women's Institute a curious sighting, a figure in lavender, glimpsed in the churchyard at midnight, moving silently among the gravestones. He had dismissed it as a trick of the moonlight, his practical nature recoiling from superstition, but the story had taken root. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for drama, had recounted it with relish, her eyes gleaming as she speculated about ghosts and lost loves. Miss Marple, listening quietly, had noted the details. The figure's lavender hue, its fleeting presence, and the vicar's reluctance to dwell on it. Ghosts, she thought, were often less spectral than human, and humans left traces, footprints, motives, mistakes. Her nephew, Raymond West, had arrived in St. Mary Mead the previous day, his suitcase stuffed with books and his mind with skepticism. A writer by trade, he indulged his aunt's requests with a mix of amusement and curiosity, though he often teased her for seeing mysteries in every village quirk. Miss Marple had shared her thoughts over tea, her voice soft but precise as she described Mrs. Harrow, the locked door, and the echoes of Lavinia Grey's story. "I'd like you to keep watch near Lavender Cottage tonight, Raymond," she had said, her eyes meeting his. "Not too close, mind you, but close enough to see who comes and goes. There's something stirring, and I'd rather know what it is before it knows we're watching." Raymond, though dubious, had agreed, his writer's imagination piqued by the prospect of nocturnal intrigue. "You think Mrs. Harrow's sneaking about in lavender veils, Aunt Jane?" he had asked, a grin tugging at his lips. "Or do you expect a genuine ghost?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "I expect nothing, Raymond, but I observe everything, and I've learned that night has a way of revealing what day conceals." Now, as the clock neared midnight, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched, her eyes scanning the darkened village. The moon hung low, its light silvering the rooftops and casting long shadows across the lane. She thought of Lavinia Grey, whose disappearance had left a wound in St. Mary Mead, and of Mrs. Harrow, whose presence seemed to prod that wound awake. The brooch, the locked door, the scratch mark, they were clues, but to what? A secret kept, a truth buried, or something more immediate, more dangerous? Her reverie was broken by the soft crunch of footsteps on the path outside. Raymond appeared, his face pale in the moonlight, his usual confidence replaced by a taut alertness. Miss Marple opened the door before he could knock, ushering him into the warmth of her sitting room. "Well, Raymond," she asked, her voice low, "what did you see?" He sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. "Aunt Jane, I'm not sure what I saw, but it's given me the creeps. I stationed myself behind the hedge near Lavender Cottage, out of sight but with a clear view of the gate. Around 11:30, I saw a figure, a woman, I think, dressed in lavender. She stood by the gate, just standing there, not moving. I thought it might be Mrs. Harrow, but the way she moved, it was odd, almost gliding. When I stepped closer, she vanished, gone, like she'd never been there." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Vanished how, Raymond? Into the cottage, the garden, or thin air?" Raymond hesitated, his skepticism warring with his unease. "I couldn't tell. The moonlight was bright, but there were shadows, and she was just gone." I checked the gate, the path, even the garden, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs. Just the smell of lavender, stronger than it should have been. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. And Mrs. Harrow, did you see her at all? No, Raymond said. The cottage was dark, no lights in the windows. If she was up, she was keeping it quiet. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea from the pot she had kept warm, her movements deliberate as her thoughts spun. A figure in lavender, seen but not traced, suggested more than a restless widow. Raymond's description matched the vicar's, yet the absence of physical evidence, footprints, disturbed earth, pointed to something staged, perhaps, or imagined. But Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts, and she doubted Raymond's eyes had deceived him entirely. The lavender scent was a detail too specific to dismiss, tied as it was to both Lavinia Grey and Mrs. Harrow. Raymond, she said, her voice gentle but firm, you mustn't let this unsettle you. People have a way of creating their own ghosts, whether with intent or by accident. Tomorrow, I'd like you to visit the county records office. See if you can find any trace of Lavinia Grey's family, her sister Clara in particular, there. Maybe a connection to Mrs. Harrow we've yet to uncover. Raymond nodded, his colour returning. You think Mrs. Harrow's playing at something, don't you? Dressing up as Lavinia to scare the village, maybe. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think, Raymond, that Mrs. Harrow is a woman with a purpose, and purposes can lead to all manner of acts. But we'll know more when we know more. After Raymond left, promising to keep watch again the following night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting still untouched. She thought of her youth, of a village girl who had dressed as her own sister to trick a suitor, a harmless prank that had ended in tears. Motives, she knew, were as varied as the stitches in her knitting, some bold, some hidden, some unraveling. Under scrutiny, the midnight visitor, whether Mrs. Harrow or another, was a thread in the pattern, and Miss Marple would follow it. Step by careful step, the church clock chimed 1, its notes fading into the night. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping to the floor, and moved to her desk. She jotted a note to herself. Lavender, figure deliberate or delusion. Check Ellen's movements. Doors scratch mark recent or old. The questions were small, but they were seeds, and Miss Marple, with her patient gardener's touch, would nurture them until they bloomed into truth. Chapter 6. The past resurfaces. Autumn days in St. Mary Mead had taken on a crisp edge, the kind that sharpened both the air and the senses. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest sitting room, felt the season's bite as she sipped her morning tea, her eyes resting on the garden where the last roses clung stubbornly to their stems. The events at Lavender Cottage weighed on her mind, each detail a thread in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. The midnight visitor Raymond had seen, cloaked in lavender and vanishing without trace, had deepened her suspicions. Mrs. Elspeth Harrow's guarded demeanor, the locked door with its telltale scratch, and the amethyst brooch that echoed Lavinia Grey's all pointed to a mystery rooted in the past, stirring like a sleeper roused by an unquiet dream. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a letter from Raymond, postmarked from the county records office. His handwriting, usually bold, betrayed a haste that suggested discovery. Aunt Jane, he wrote, Clara Grey, Lavinia's sister, died 10 years ago in Bristol, but she left a daughter, Elspeth, born 1885. No record of a husband named Harrow. But Elspeth Grey inherited Clara's papers, including a diary said to belong to Lavinia. I've requested access through a contact at the Bristol Archives. We'll keep you posted." Miss Marple folded the letter, her lips pursed. Elspeth Grey. The name was a spark, igniting possibilities. Could Mrs. Harrow be Lavinia's niece, come to St. Mary Mead to uncover her aunt's fate? Or was her purpose less innocent, tied to the secrets hidden behind that locked door? Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Price, the village's oldest resident, whose memory stretched back to the days of Lavinia Grey. Mrs. Price lived in a tiny cottage near the church, its walls crowded with photographs, and its air thick with the scent of lavender potpourri, coincidence that Miss Marple noted with a faint smile. She dressed in a tweed skirt and a woolen cardigan, her hat pinned with a modest brooch, and set out with her walking stick, though her step was firmer than her years suggested. The village was quiet, save for the chatter of sparrows and the distant clatter of a milk cart. As she passed Lavender Cottage, she paused, her eyes lingering on its windows, which stared back like unblinking eyes. No movement stirred within, but the lavender bushes swayed in the breeze, their scent sharp and haunting. Mrs. Price welcomed her with a cackle of delight, her roomy eyes bright with the prospect of company. "Jane Marple, you old sleuth," she said, ushering her into a parlour stuffed with doilies and faded cushions. "Come to pick my brain about something, haven't you? I can see it in your face." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a creaking armchair. "You know me too well, Mrs. Price. I've been thinking about Lavender Cottage and Lavinia Grey. You were here when she disappeared, weren't you? What do you remember?" Mrs. Price's face softened, her gaze drifting to a photograph of a long-ago village fete. Lavinia was a lovely girl, gentle as a lamb but with a spark in her, always in lavender, like she was born to it. She was set to marry Edward Langley, a fine young man, but he took ill and died heart, they said, though there was talk of poison, never proven, mind you. Lavinia was heartbroken, shut herself up in that cottage. Then one night, she was gone. No note, no trace, just her lavender gowns left hanging in the wardrobe. Miss Marple leaned forward, her hands folded. And Thomas Reed. The papers mentioned him. Mrs. Price's eyes narrowed. Oh, Thomas was a dark one. Loved Lavinia, but not the way she wanted. Jealous, he was, always watching her, especially after Edward came along. When Edward died, Thomas was around more, hovering like a storm cloud. After Lavinia vanished, he left St. Mary Mead in a hurry. Folks said he'd done her in, but there was no proof. No body, you see. And Lavinia's sister, Clara, Miss Marple prompted gently. Clara was younger, fiercer, Mrs. Price said. She swore she'd find out what happened to Lavinia, but she left the village a year later, married some fellow in Bristol, never came back, far as I know, but she was stubborn. If anyone kept Lavinia's memory alive, it'd be Clara, or her kin. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Price, her mind turning over the new details. Clara's daughter, Elspeth, could indeed be Mrs. Harrow. Her lavender dresses a tribute to her lost aunt, her presence in the cottage a quest for answers. But the midnight visitor complicated things. Was it Mrs. Harrow staging a ghostly apparition, for reasons unknown, or someone else, drawn to the cottage by its reawakening? That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the village post office, where she sent a telegram to Raymond, urging him to expedite his search for Lavinia's diary. She also inquired about Thomas Reed's whereabouts after 1875, a task she knew might yield little but was worth pursuing. As she returned home, she passed the churchyard, where Mr. Clement's sighting of the lavender figure had sparked the latest gossip. The gravestones stood silent, their shadows long in the fading light, and Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the ground. No footprints marred the grass, but a faint scent of lavender lingered, as if the air itself carried the past. Back in her cottage, she lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting a pretext for thought. The past was resurfacing, not as a ghost, but as a series of choices: Lavinia's, Thomas Reed's, perhaps Clara's. Mrs. Harrow, whether Elspeth Grey or not, was the catalyst, her arrival stirring memories long buried. Miss Marple thought of a case from her youth, a man who had returned to his village under a false name, seeking to right an old wrong. Motives, she knew, could lie dormant for decades, only to flare into life when prodded by chance or intent. As dusk fell, she received a visitor, Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with news. "Jane, you'll never guess," she said, bursting into the sitting room. "Mrs. Harrow's been seen walking the lanes at night, always in lavender. The butcher's boy swears he saw her near the cottage gate, just like Raymond's ghost." "What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I make nothing of it yet, Dolly, but I'm listening. People walk at night for all sorts of reasons: insomnia, sorrow, or something they don't wish seen by day." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "You think she's up to something, don't you? Oh, Jane, you must tell me what you find out." Miss Marple promised nothing, but her mind was already weaving the new thread into the pattern. The lavender figure, the locked door, the brooch, and now Mrs. Harrow's nocturnal wanderings. They were pieces of a story that was not yet whole. She would wait for Raymond's findings, for the diary that might hold Lavinia's final words, and for the next ripple in St. Mary Mead's quiet surface. The past, she knew, had a way of speaking, and Miss Marple, with her patient ear, would hear it out. Chapter 7. The break-in tranquility of St. Mary Mead was shattered one stormy night, when the wind howled through the lanes and rain lashed against the windows of every cottage, including Miss Jane Marple's modest home. She sat by her fire, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her thoughts consumed by the enigma of Lavender Cottage. The threads of the mystery, Mrs. Elspeth Harrow's guarded demeanor, the locked door with its telltale scratch, the amethyst brooch echoing Lavinia Grey's, and the fleeting figure in lavender seen by Raymond and Mr. Clement, had woven a pattern that was both intricate and incomplete. Miss Marple, with her patient clarity, sensed that the storm outside was a fitting prelude to a disruption closer to home. The news came at dawn, delivered by a breathless Mrs. Bantry, who arrived at Miss Marple's door with her umbrella dripping, and her eyes wide with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe it," she exclaimed, shaking off the rain. "Lavender Cottage was broken into last night. Mrs. Harrow's in a state, though she says nothing was taken. Inspector Craddock's there now, poking about. You must come." Miss Marple, ever composed, set aside her tea and donned her coat, her mind already turning over the implications. A break-in in a village as sleepy as St. Mary Mead was no small matter, and its timing amid the whispers of Lavinia Grey and the mystery of Mrs. Harrowsag jested more than mere coincidence. She followed Mrs. Bantry through the lanes, her stick tapping a steady rhythm, her eyes scanning the familiar paths for anything out of place. The storm had left its mark. Broken branches littered the ground, and the lavender bushes outside the cottage sagged under the weight of the rain, their scent sharp and mournful at Lavender Cottage. Inspector Craddock greeted them, his face grim, but his manner professional. A young man with a keen mind, he respected Miss Marple's insight, having benefited from it in past cases. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, he said, tipping his hat. A queer business, this. Mrs. Harrow found the back door forced open this morning, and the upstairs room, the one she keeps locked, was tampered with. The lock's broken, but she claims nothing's missing. I'm not so sure. Mrs. Harrow stood in the drawing room, her lavender dress immaculate despite the hour, her silver hair slightly dishevelled, her hands clasped tightly before her, and the amethyst brooch at her throat gleamed dully in the grey light. It's nothing, really, she said, her voice strained. Some vagrant, perhaps, seeking shelter from the storm. I've checked my belongings, and all is accounted for. Miss Marple's eyes, soft but piercing, took in the scene. The drawing room was as she remembered it, with its faded portraits and polished furniture, but the air felt charged, as if the storm had left behind more than rain. The oak door, once locked, now stood slightly ajar, its brass keyhole mangled. She approached it, her movements unhurried, and peered into the room beyond. It was a small bedroom, untouched by time, its air heavy with dust and the faint scent of lavender. A single chair lay overturned, its legs pointing skyward like an accusation, and a faded lavender shawl draped over a dresser seemed to shimmer in the dim light. May I look closer, Inspector? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Craddock nodded. Go ahead, Miss Marple. You've a knack for seeing what we miss. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning every detail. The narrow bed with its patched quilt, the cracked mirror reflecting a ghostly image of the shawl, the floorboards. Worn but clean. Her gaze settled on a panel in the wall, its edges slightly misaligned, as if it had been pried open and hastily shut. She pointed it out to Craddock, who knelt to examine it. With a gentle push, the panel swung inward, revealing a small cavity. Inside was a bundle of letters, their paper yellowed and brittle, tied with a faded ribbon. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene. Letters, Craddock said, lifting the bundle with care. Addressed to Miss Lavinia Grey, from Edward Langley, dated 1875, just before her disappearance. He glanced at Mrs. Harrow, who had followed them to the doorway, her face pale. Did you know these were here, Mrs. Harrow? The widow's lips parted, then closed. No, she said faintly. I never opened that panel. The room was locked. When I arrived, I kept it that way too. Preserve it. Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Mrs. Harrow's fingers brushed her brooch, as if seeking comfort. A wise choice, she said gently. Old rooms hold memories, and memories can be fragile, but they can also tell us much if we listen. Craddock bagged the letters for evidence, promising to examine them later. He questioned Ellen, the maid, who hovered nearby, her eyes wide with fear. She claimed to have heard nothing during the storm, her room at the back of the cottage too far to catch the sound of a break-in. Miss Marple observed the girl's trembling hands, her quick glances at Mrs. Harrow, and wondered if fear, not ignorance, kept her silent as they left the cottage. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the village stirred with curious onlookers. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind piecing together the morning's discoveries. The break-in was no random act. The forced door, the tampered lock, and the hidden letters suggested purpose, perhaps desperation. The letters, addressed to Lavinia, might hold the key to her fate, and Miss Marple resolved to read them with Craddock's permission. She thought of Thomas Reed, the jealous suitor who had fled St. Mary Mead, and wondered if the past had stirred him to action, or if Mrs. Harrow herself had orchestrated the intrusion to uncover what lay hidden. Back in her cottage, Miss received a telegram from Raymond, confirming that Lavinia's diary was en route from Bristol, secured through his contact at the archives. The diary, he wrote, contained entries up to the night of Lavinia's disappearance, hinting at a confrontation with Thomas Reed over Edward Langley's death. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The break-in, the letters, the diary, they were converging, like streams feeding a river, and she sensed the current would soon reveal its source. She sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, and jotted a note. Break-in staged or genuine. Letters hidden, not stolen. Why? Ellen's fear loyalty or coercion? The questions multiplied, but Miss Marple was patient. The past, like the storm, had broken open, and its secrets, like the lavender scent that clung to the air, would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 8. The truth unfolds. The days following the break-in at Lavender Cottage carried a restless energy through St. Mary Mead, as if the storm had stirred more than leaves and whispers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy sitting room, felt the weight of the mystery pressing closer, like a book nearing its final pages. The bundle of letters found behind the hidden panel, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to every clue, and the nervous demeanor of Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, all pointed to a truth that was beginning to emerge from the shadows of the past. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched, her needle silent as her mind wove together the threads of Lavinia Grey's story with the enigma of the cottage's current occupant. Raymond West's telegram had promised the imminent arrival of Lavinia's diary, a relic of 1875, that might hold the final words of a woman whose disappearance had haunted St. Mary Mead for half a century. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath the surface, suspected the diary would confirm what she had begun to piece together. Mrs. Harrow was no mere newcomer, but a woman tied to Lavinia's fate, perhaps by blood, perhaps by purpose. The break-in, with its forced lock and untouched letters, suggested someone was searching for answers or seeking to bury them. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Thomas Reed, the jealous suitor who had fled after Lavinia vanished. Could he still be alive, an old man drawn back by the cottage's reawakening? Or was Mrs. Harrow herself orchestrating the drama, her lavender dresses a deliberate echo of the past? The diary arrived that afternoon, delivered by a courier from Bristol, its leather cover worn but intact, its pages brittle with age. Miss Marple handled it with care, her gloved fingers tracing the faded ink of Lavinia's neat script. She settled by her fire, a pot of tea at her side, and began to read. The entries painted a vivid picture. Lavinia's love for Edward Langley, her joy at their engagement, and her growing unease as Thomas Reed's jealousy darkened their happiness. The final entry, dated the night of her disappearance, was chilling. Thomas came again, his eyes wild. He speaks of Edward's death, as if he knows more than he says. I fear he did something terrible. I must confront him tonight, at the cottage. If I am wrong, God, forgive me. If I am right, I may not see tomorrow. Miss Marple closed the diary, her heart heavy. Lavinia had suspected Thomas Reed of murdering Edward, and her confrontation had likely led to her own demise. The letters, found in the hidden panel, penned by Edward, supported this. The last one, dated days before his death, hinted at a meeting with Thomas, who had accused him of betraying Lavinia. He threatens me, Edward wrote, but I will not yield her to his anger. The pieces were falling into place, but Mrs. Harrow's role remained unclear. Was she Elspeth Grey, Clara's daughter, seeking justice for her aunt? Or was she hiding a darker truth? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Harrow to tea at her cottage, framing it as a neighbourly gesture. The widow arrived promptly, her lavender dress as elegant as ever, the amethyst brooch pinned at her throat. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, as if the break-in had left her sleepless. Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate, her voice gentle but probing. "You must be shaken after the break-in, Mrs. Harrow," she began, offering a scone. "Such a violation, and in so quiet a village. Have you any idea who might have done it?" Mrs. Harrow's fingers tightened around her cup. "None," she said, her voice low. "As I told Inspector Craddock, nothing was taken. It was likely some vagrant, caught in the storm." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Perhaps. But old houses hold secrets, don't they? I couldn't help but notice the letters found in that hidden panel. Letters to Lavinia Grey from her fiancé. They suggest a tragedy, one that might still cast a shadow." Mrs. Harrow's composure faltered, her hand brushing the brooch. "I know nothing of those letters," she said, too quickly. "The cottage came as it was. I have no interest in its past." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone soft but relentless. "Yet you wear a brooch so like Lavinia's, described in old papers as a family heirloom. And your lavender dresses forgive an old woman's curiosity, but they remind me of her. You're not, by chance, related to the Greys? Clara, perhaps Lavinia's sister?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the scent of lavender. Mrs. Harrow's face drained of colour, and her cup rattled in its saucer. For a moment, silence, stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then, as if a dam had broken, she spoke, her voice trembling. "You're too clever, Miss Marple. Yes, I am Elspeth Grey, Clara's daughter. My mother never forgot Lavinia, never believed she'd run away. When I inherited her papers, including Lavinia's diary, I came here to find the truth. The brooch was my aunt's, passed to my mother, then to me. I wear it to honor her and the lavender. It feels right, somehow." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unwavering. "And the break-in, the locked door. You've been searching, haven't you?" Mrs. Harrow's eyes filled with tears. "I found the letters a week ago, hidden in that panel. They confirmed what the diary suggested. Thomas Reed killed Edward. And likely Lavinia too. I locked the room to protect them until I could decide what to do. But after the break-in, I'm afraid. I think Thomas is still alive, watching me. I've seen shadows near the cottage, felt eyes on me at night." Miss Marple's mind raced, but her face remained serene. "You've been brave, my dear, but secrets like these draw danger. Have you told Inspector Craddock?" Mrs. Harrow shook her head. "I couldn't, not yet. I needed proof. But I'm frightened, Miss Marple. What if he comes back?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but firm. "Leave that to me and to Inspector Craddock. We'll see this through." She saw Mrs. Harrow to the door, her mind already planning the next step. Elspeth Grey's confession had clarified much, but the shadow of Thomas Reed loomed larger now, a figure from the past who might yet walk the present. That evening, she telephoned Craddock, sharing the diary's contents and Mrs. Harrow's identity. "We must be vigilant, Inspector," she said. "If Thomas Reed is alive, he's been stirred by Elspeth's arrival. And if he's watching, he'll act again." Miss Marple returned to her armchair, the diary open on her lap. The truth was unfolding, but not yet complete. The lavender figure, the break-in, the letters, they were all part of Lavinia's story, and Elspeth's quest to finish it. Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would ensure that the past, like the cottage's scent, was brought fully into the light. Chapter 9. The trap. The air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that seemed to seep into the bones, as if the village itself sensed the tension coiling around Lavender Cottage. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her fire, felt the weight of the unfolding mystery as keenly as the autumn frost. Elspeth Grey's confession had cast a new light on the puzzle. She was Lavinia's niece, driven by her mother Clara's vow to uncover the truth about her sister's disappearance. The diary, the letters, the amethyst brooch all pointed to Thomas Reed, the jealous suitor who had likely killed both Edward Langley and Lavinia Grey before fleeing St. Mary Mead 50 years ago. Yet the break-in, the lavender-clad figure seen at midnight, and Elspeth's fear of being watched suggested that Reed, or someone acting in his shadow, was still a threat. Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, knew that the time for watching had passed. It was time to act. The morning sun was pale, filtering through a mist that clung to the village lanes. Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice calm but urgent. "We must draw out the truth, Inspector," she said, and quickly. Mrs. Haramis Grey rather is frightened, and with reason. If Thomas Reed is alive, or if someone else is stirring this old wound, we must catch them before they strike again. She outlined a plan, simple yet bold. A public reading of Lavinia's letters at Lavender Cottage, announced in the village to ensure word reached every ear. The event would be a lure, tempting the watcher, whether Reed or another, to reveal themselves. The locked room, now breached, would be left accessible, its contents a bait too tempting to resist. Craddock, though initially skeptical, trusted Miss Marple's instincts. "It's a risk, Miss Marple," he said, "but I'll have men nearby. Out of sight. If someone takes the bait, we'll be ready." Miss Marple then visited Elspeth Grey, finding her in the drawing room of Lavender Cottage. Her lavender dress, a stark contrast to her pallor. The amethyst brooch gleamed at her throat, a symbol of her quest and her vulnerability. "Miss Grey," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but firm, "we have a chance to end this. Will you help us by hosting a reading of Lavinia's letters? It may draw out the one who's watching you." Elspeth's eyes widened, her hand clutching. "The brooch, you think it's Thomas Reed, don't you? An old man now, but still dangerous." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that someone is drawn to this cottage, to you, and to Lavinia's story. Whether it's Red or another, we'll find out. You'll be safe, my dear. Inspector Craddock will ensure it." Elspeth hesitated, then nodded, her resolve hardening. "For Lavinia, I'll do it. She deserves the truth." The announcement was made discreetly but effectively, through Mrs. Bantry's eager gossip and a notice in the village shop. Mrs. Harrow to read historic letters at Lavender Cottage. It read, revealing the past of our beloved village. By evening, the news had spread, and whispers of Lavinia Grey's tragedy filled the air like the scent of lavender that drifted from the cottage's garden. The reading was set for dusk, when the village settled into its quietest hour. Miss Marple arrived early, her tweed coat buttoned against the chill, her eyes scanning the gathering crowd. Mrs. Bantry, agog with anticipation, Mr. Clement, his face thoughtful, and a handful of villagers, drawn by curiosity. Elspeth stood by the tea table, her lavender dress catching the firelight, her hands steady as she held the bundle of letters. Inspector Craddock lingered at the edge of the room, his presence unobtrusive but reassuring, while two plainclothes officers waited outside. Hidden in the shadows of the garden, Miss Marple positioned herself near the once locked door, now left ajar, its broken lock a silent invitation. She had suggested to Craddock that the room be left as it was, the lavender shawl draped over the chair, the hidden panel slightly open, as if tempting a thief to return. Her eyes, sharp beneath her mild expression, watched the guests, the door, and Elspeth, who began to read in a clear, trembling voice. "My dearest Lavinia," she read from Edward's final letter, "Thomas threatens me, but I will not yield. Meet me tomorrow, and we shall face him together." The words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. The crowd listened, rapt, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. A faint creak sounded from the staircase, and her heart quickened. She glanced at Craddock, who nodded almost imperceptibly. As Elspeth continued, her voice rising with emotion, a shadow moved in the hallway, a figure, stooped and silent, slipping toward the open door. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she remained still, her hands folded in her lap. The figure, a man with a limp and grizzled hair, hesitated at the threshold, his eyes fixed on the room's contents. He stepped inside, his movements furtive, and reached for the hidden panel. Miss Marple signaled Craddock with a slight tilt of her head. The inspector moved swiftly, his men emerging from the shadows as the man spun around, his face a mask of fear and defiance. "Thomas Reed," said, his voice firm, "you're under arrest." The crowd gasped, and Elspeth dropped the letters, her hand flying to her brooch. The man, his face weathered but unmistakable from old descriptions, glared at them, his voice hoarse. "I only wanted the letters," he muttered. "They'd prove nothing now." Miss Marple rose, her voice soft but clear. "They prove enough, Mr. Reed. Lavinia's diary, Edward's letters, they tell a story of jealousy and murder. You couldn't let it rest, could you?" Under questioning at the station, Reed confessed, his words spilling like water from a broken dam. He had loved Lavinia, but her devotion to Edward had driven him to rage. He had poisoned Edward, believing Lavinia would turn to him, but when she confronted him, suspecting the truth, he had killed her in a fit of panic, hiding her body in the cottage's cellar, sealed behind a false wall. When Elspeth arrived, her lavender dresses and probing stirred his fear, and he had broken in to retrieve the letters, hoping to erase the past. Miss Marple listened, her face serene but her heart heavy. The trap had worked, but the truth it revealed was a bitter one. As she left the station, the night air was cold, the scent of lavender faint but lingering. The cottage, she knew, would never be free of its past, but perhaps now it could find peace. Chapter 10. The lady revealed the storm that had shaken St. Mary Mead had passed, leaving a sky of unblemished blue and a village that seemed to breathe more icily, as if relieved of a long-held burden. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her armchair by the window, watched the morning light spill across her garden, where the last roses bowed under the weight of dew. The events at Lavender Cottage had reached their climax, with Thomas Reed's confession laying bare a tragedy 50 years in the making. Yet, for Miss Marple, the resolution brought not triumph but a quiet sorrow, for truths uncovered often carried the sting of loss. Her knitting lay in her lap, untouched, as she reflected on the final pieces of the puzzle that had brought Lavinia Grey's story to light. Inspector Craddock had acted swiftly after Reed's apprehension. With Elspeth Grey's permission, he ordered a search of Lavender Cottage's cellar, a damp and shadowed space sealed behind a false wall that Reed had described in his confession. The work was meticulous, guided by Miss Marple's suggestion to look for signs of disturbance in the stonework. By midday, the labourers uncovered a grim discovery: the remains of a woman, her bones wrapped in the tattered remnants of a lavender gown. Pinned to the fabric was an amethyst brooch, its silver filigree dulled by time, but unmistakable. The village, gathered at a respectful distance, fell silent, their whispers of ghosts replaced by the weight of reality. Lavinia Grey, the lady in lavender, had never left her cottage. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden as the remains were carefully removed, her eyes soft but steady. Elspeth Grey, her face pale but composed, stood beside her, the matching brooch at her throat gleaming in the sunlight. "It's her, isn't it?" Elspeth whispered, her voice breaking. "My Aunt Lavinia." Miss Marple nodded, her hand resting lightly on Elspeth's arm. "Yes, my dear. She's been found at last. You've given her that much peace and a name." The coroner's report, delivered later that day, confirmed the identity through dental records and the brooch, which matched descriptions in Clara Grey's papers. The cause of death was a fracture to the skull, consistent with Reed's account of a struggle gone wrong. He had confessed to striking Lavinia in a moment of rage when she accused him of poisoning Edward Langley. Overwhelmed by guilt and fear, he had hidden her body in the cellar, sealing it behind a wall he built himself, then fled St. Mary Mead, living under assumed names for decades. Elspeth's arrival, her lavender dresses, and her probing into Lavinia. Fate had drawn him back, his fear of exposure driving the break-in and his nocturnal watch over the cottage. Elspeth, though shaken, found a measure of closure. She invited Miss Marple to Lavender Cottage that evening, a gesture of gratitude and a need to share the burden of truth. The drawing room, once heavy with secrets, felt lighter, though the scent of lavender lingered, as if woven into the walls. The oak door, now permanently unlocked, stood open, revealing the small bedroom where the letters had been found. Elspeth poured tea, her hands steady, her lavender dress a quiet homage to her aunt. "I came here to find her," she said, her voice soft. "I thought I'd uncover a story, not this, but I'm glad it's over." "Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what I couldn't." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression gentle. "Only saw what was there to see, my dear. You brought Lavinia's story to light by coming here, by wearing her brooch, by asking questions. Sometimes it takes courage to stir the past, even when it hurts." Elspeth's eyes filled with tears. "I'll sell the cottage," she said. "It's too full of ghost snot, the kind people imagine, but the kind that live in memory. I want to remember Lavinia as she was, not as a tragedy." Miss Marple nodded, understanding. "A wise choice. Some places hold their stories too tightly. You've done right by her, and that's enough." The village, though abuzz with the news, treated Elspeth with a newfound respect, their gossip tempered by sympathy. Mrs. Bantry, calling on Miss Marple the next day, was uncharacteristically subdued. "It's a sad end, Jane," she said, settling into a chair. "Poor Lavinia, hidden all those years. And that Reed, what a monster, to live with that secret for so long." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. "People carry their secrets in different ways, Dolly. Some bury them, some run from them, but they rarely escape. Lavinia's story is told now, and that's what matters." As the days passed, Lavender Cottage was put up for sale, its windows dark once more. Elspeth Grey left St. Mary Mead, her lavender dresses packed away, her brooch a keepsake of a quest fulfilled. Thomas Reed faced trial, his confession ensuring justice, though his age made imprisonment a formality. Miss Marple, returning to her quiet routine, took up her knitting again, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The village settled back into its rhythm, but the memory of Lavinia Grey lingered, a soft echo in the scent of lavender that drifted from the cottage's garden. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village stir under the autumn sun. She thought of a case from her youth, a woman who had hidden her sister's letters to protect her memory, only to find they held the key to her freedom. Truth, she knew, was a fragile thing, easily buried but persistent, like the lavender that bloomed year after year. The lady in lavender had been revealed, not as a ghost, but as a woman whose story, though tragic, had finally found its voice. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, turned her gaze to the horizon, ready for the next ripple in St. Mary Mead's tranquil surface. The end.